The house in Vermont felt too quiet after Michael Carter's funeral, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and Emily Carter moved through each room with careful steps, afraid that one wrong movement might shatter what little balance she had left, because grief did not come loudly for her but slowly, in waves that tightened her chest without warning, and the first evening alone made her realize how deeply silence could hurt, especially when it replaced laughter, late-night talks, and the small routines she had shared with her husband. Michael had been steady, kind, and older than her, and when illness took him, it left behind unfinished sentences and plans that no one else could complete. And though friends called and neighbors brought food, none of that filled the hollow space that followed her from room to room, until she remembered Daniel, Michael's son from his first marriage, who had returned from Boston for the funeral and quietly stayed, not saying when he would leave, only unpacking his bag in the old guest room, as if he sensed that leaving too soon would feel wrong. Emily and Daniel had never been close in a dramatic way, but there had always been a gentle respect between them, built from shared dinners, polite conversations, and the unspoken understanding that they both loved the same man in different ways. And now that man was gone, leaving them alone together in a house that suddenly felt too big for just one grieving widow. On the third night after the funeral, Emily wandered downstairs unable to sleep, her thoughts racing faster than the clock on the wall, when she heard a sound she did not expect, soft at first, almost unsure, then clearer, steadier, filling the air with something warm and human, and she stopped in the hallway as she realized Daniel was playing the piano Michael had kept near the window, the same piano that had not been touched in years, and the notes carried emotion without words, sadness mixed with strength, memory mixed with hope, and Emily felt tears rise before she could stop them. Not because the music reminded her of Michael, but because it reminded her that life was still moving even when she felt frozen. She leaned against the wall, listening, feeling her breathing slow as the music seemed to hold her upright. And for the first time since the funeral, she did not feel like she was drowning, and when the music paused for a moment, a sharp fear rushed through her, the fear of being left alone with her thoughts again, and without planning to speak, without thinking about how it might sound, she whispered into the quiet space, "Please, don't stop," her voice breaking just enough to reveal how much she needed that sound to continue. And after a brief pause, the music returned, stronger than before, flowing through the house and through her, grounding her in the present moment, and Emily realized then that something important was happening, something she could not fully name yet, a connection born not from comfort or choice, but from shared loss and shared silence. And as she stood there listening, she felt the first small shift inside her heart, not toward happiness, not toward answers, but toward survival, toward the understanding that grief did not have to be faced alone, even if the path ahead was unclear. And when the final note faded into the night, Emily remained still, knowing that this moment, quiet and fragile, had changed something between them, and that whatever came next would not be simple, but it would matter. In the days that followed that first night, the piano became part of the house again, not as furniture, but as a voice, and Daniel played every evening without being asked, sometimes slow and thoughtful, sometimes steady and strong, as if his hands understood emotions he did not yet have words for, and Emily began shaping her days around those hours, finishing chores early, letting the evening light fade while she waited for the first note to rise, because the music gave her something to hold on to, something that pushed back the sharp edges of grief without pretending it was gone. She never told Daniel how much it helped at first, choosing instead to listen quietly from the stairs or the hallway, afraid that if she named the comfort it might disappear. But slowly the distance between them softened, not physically but emotionally. And one evening Daniel looked up from the piano and saw her sitting on the last step, her hands folded tightly, her eyes tired yet present, and instead of stopping he finished the piece, letting the final note settle before speaking, asking gently if the sound bothered her, and Emily surprised herself by answering honestly, telling him it made the house feel alive again, and Daniel nodded, as if he understood more than she expected, admitting that playing helped him too, that when his fingers moved he felt closer to his father without drowning in memory, and that talking felt harder than music, and from that night forward they shared the space openly, not as a widow and a stepson struggling with roles, but as two people navigating the same storm from different sides. They talked between songs, never too long, never too deep at once, but enough to loosen the weight inside their chests, about Michael's habits, his quiet humor, the way he believed things would always work out, and sometimes about the future, though that subject still felt fragile, and Emily found herself learning new things about Daniel, about his doubts, his plans that felt uncertain now, his fear of moving forward too quickly or staying stuck too long, and she realized how young he still was beneath his calm surface, how much he carried without asking for help. There were moments when Emily caught herself relying on those evenings too much, when she felt disappointed if Daniel came home late or skipped a night. And that scared her, not because of him, but because of herself, because she did not want to replace one loss with another kind of need she could not manage. And so she tried to pull back, filling her evenings with distractions, phone calls, television noise, but nothing replaced the quiet strength of shared presence. And Daniel noticed the shift even when she tried to hide it, noticing the way she no longer sat nearby, the way her answers grew shorter. And one night he stopped playing early, asking if she was all right. And Emily felt a lump in her throat as she realized she had no simple answer, only the truth that grief changes shape, and sometimes comfort feels dangerous when it matters too much. She told him she didn't want to lean on him unfairly, that she was afraid of becoming dependent on something that could not last, and Daniel listened without interruption, his expression steady, then told her something that stayed with her long after, that support does not always mean dependence, that sharing space in hard moments does not create obligation, and that healing often happens quietly between people who choose to be kind without crossing lines. And his words, spoken without drama, made Emily realize how much respect guided his actions, how carefully he moved within boundaries she had feared might blur, and that realization brought relief instead of tension. The piano returned that night not as escape, but as balance, filling the room with calm rather than urgency. And Emily understood that what made those evenings meaningful was not the music alone, but the mutual understanding beneath it, the shared decision to remain present without expectation. And as days passed, she felt stronger, not because the pain faded, but because she was no longer facing it alone. And Daniel too seemed lighter, more focused, making plans again, talking about work opportunities and the possibility of moving to Canada. And Emily encouraged him, even when the thought of him leaving made her chest tighten, because she knew growth should not be held back by fear. And when she went to bed that night, listening to the last notes fade into silence, she did not beg for them to continue, because she finally trusted that the quiet would no longer break her, and that whatever came next, she would be able to stand within it, whole enough to let others move forward while carrying gratitude instead of regret. As autumn settled over Vermont, the air grew sharper and the days shorter. And with that change came a quiet shift between Emily and Daniel that neither of them planned but both could feel, because comfort, when left unspoken, can slowly turn into distance if fear enters the space. And Emily began waking each morning with a heavy sense of caution, worried not about Daniel himself, but about what it meant to rely on someone during a time when her emotions were still unsteady, and she found herself watching her words more closely, stepping back during conversations, choosing solitude when she once welcomed company, believing that strength meant handling grief alone, even though her heart disagreed. Daniel noticed these changes not as rejection, but as confusion, sensing that something meaningful was being pushed aside without explanation. And one evening when the piano stayed silent and the house returned to its old stillness, he finally asked what had changed, his voice calm but honest, and Emily struggled to explain the conflict inside her, the fear of being misunderstood by others, the fear of leaning too much on a connection that might not last, the fear of crossing invisible lines that society guards closely even when intentions are pure. And she admitted that grief had blurred her sense of balance, making her doubt her own judgment. And Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every word without defense, then spoke with a clarity that surprised her, explaining that connection does not become wrong simply because it brings comfort, that boundaries are defined by actions and respect, not by fear, and that pushing people away in the name of strength can sometimes slow healing rather than protect it. His words carried no pressure, no expectation, only understanding. And in that moment Emily realized she had underestimated him, seeing him only as a young man navigating loss, not as someone capable of emotional depth and restraint, and that realization forced her to confront her own assumptions about age, roles, and responsibility, recognizing that respect had always guided their interactions even when emotions ran deep, and that what they shared was not confusion, but clarity built on shared values. Still, the tension did not vanish overnight, because grief does not release its grip easily, and Emily continued to wrestle with doubt, especially when Daniel began talking more openly about his future, mentioning job interviews in Toronto and opportunities that would take him far from the house that had become a place of healing for both of them. And while she encouraged him sincerely, telling him he deserved to move forward without hesitation, she felt the familiar ache of loss forming again, not romantic or possessive, but rooted in the fear of returning to silence. And this time she chose not to hide that feeling, admitting that she would miss the evenings, the conversations, the music, and the shared understanding that had grown between them. And Daniel responded with reassurance rather than promises, telling her that distance would not erase what they had built, that some connections remain steady even when daily presence changes, and that growth does not require forgetting. The piano returned after that conversation, not every night, not as ritual, but as choice, and when Daniel played, Emily listened. Without clinging, appreciating the moment without fearing its end, and that shift marked an important step in her healing, because she was no longer holding on to comfort out of desperation, but welcoming it as part of a larger journey forward. Neighbors began to notice the change too, commenting on how Emily seemed steadier, more engaged with life, attending community events again, volunteering at the local library, rebuilding routines that grief had paused, and Daniel watched this progress with quiet pride, knowing his role had been supportive rather than central, and that understanding brought him peace as well, freeing him from the worry of being needed in ways he could not sustain. As winter approached and Daniel prepared to leave, the house no longer felt like a place of waiting but a place of transition, and Emily found herself grateful rather than afraid, because she had learned something essential during those months, that healing does not come from isolation or from clinging, but from honest connection balanced by respect. And when she stood in the living room one evening, listening to the piano for what she knew might be the last time, she did not ask him to continue, did not beg the moment to stay, because she understood now that fullness does not depend on permanence, and that what truly filled her was not sound or presence alone, but the knowledge that she could face loss without losing herself. And that realization, steady and quiet, stayed with her long after the final note faded into silence. The final weeks passed quickly, as if time itself understood that holding on too tightly would only make the goodbye harder, and Emily noticed how the house had changed not in structure, but in feeling, because it no longer echoed with despair, but carried a quiet strength built from acceptance. And Daniel moved through his days with purpose, finishing preparations for his new job in Toronto, packing his books, sorting papers, closing one chapter without regret. And Emily watched this process, with mixed emotions that no longer frightened her, because sadness and pride now lived side by side without conflict. They shared meals, talked about ordinary things, laughed at small memories of Michael that no longer brought sharp pain, and the piano remained part of the space, though Daniel played less often, choosing instead to let the silence stand on its own, and Emily realized she no longer needed sound to feel steady, because the emptiness that once consumed her had been replaced by something quieter and stronger, a sense of completeness that came from understanding herself again. On the morning Daniel was set to leave, the sky was pale and clear, and the house felt calm, not heavy, and as he carried his final bag to the door, Emily stood nearby feeling the weight of the moment without letting it overwhelm her. And when they hugged, it was brief, but meaningful, filled with gratitude rather than fear, and she told him sincerely that his presence had helped her survive the hardest season of her life, while Daniel thanked her for giving him space to grieve without pressure or expectation, acknowledging that the house had been a place of healing for him too. There were no promises to call every day, no dramatic words about the future, only mutual respect and the understanding that meaningful connections do not need constant contact to remain real. And as Daniel stepped outside and closed the door behind him, Emily felt the quiet settle again, but this time it did not crush her, because it was no longer empty silence but peaceful stillness. In the days that followed, Emily returned fully to her life, meeting friends for coffee, tending her garden, taking long walks through the changing seasons, and she noticed how often she smiled without effort, how her thoughts no longer circled endlessly around loss. And though she still missed Michael deeply, the pain had softened into memory rather than absence, and she carried Daniel's influence with her not as dependence, but as reminder, proof that connection can heal without complicating, that support can exist without crossing lines, and that love in its healthiest form respects distance as much as closeness. Months later, a letter arrived from Toronto, simple and warm, describing Daniel's new routine, his small apartment, the piano he hoped to buy someday, and Emily wrote back without urgency, sharing updates from Vermont, her work at the library, the way winter had been gentle that year, and as she sealed the envelope, she realized something important had fully settled within her, that she no longer defined fullness by who stayed or who left, but by how she chose to live. With openness, strength, and care, and as she placed the letter by the door to mail the next morning, Emily stood in the quiet house once more, breathing easily, knowing that while some chapters close, their meaning does not disappear, and that she was finally ready to move forward not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had learned how to carry it without letting it weigh her down.